"Sweep the floor, boy." That is what he said. 4 words. Loud enough for every customer in the restaurant to hear. Loud enough for the hostess to look down at her shoes. Loud enough for the line cook to stop plating and stare through the pass. The man standing in the doorway, worn canvas jacket, gray stubble catching the overhead light, a backpack so old the zippers had been replaced with safety pins, did not move, did not blink, did not drop his eyes to the floor the way the manager expected him to. He stood in the entrance of the Meridian, a polished farm-to-table restaurant on the corner of Wentworth and 4th, and he looked at the man who had just spoken to him like that with an expression that was difficult to place. Not anger, not shock, something closer to recognition. Like he had heard that exact sentence before and had been waiting, quietly, patiently, across a span of years, for someone foolish enough to say it again. The manager's name was Greg Hollister. Greg, 44 years old, regional director of operations for the Meridian Group, a chain of 11 restaurants stretching from Charlotte to Richmond. Greg had run the Wentworth flagship for 6 years. In that time, he had fired 14 staff members without documentation, redirected over $90,000 in vendor rebates to a personal account, and built a culture of silence so complete that new employees learned within their first week that there were 2 sets of rules in the building, the ones in the handbook and the ones Greg enforced with a look, a schedule change, or a quiet word in the storage room that no one else would ever hear. He wore a fitted navy suit. His watch cost more than any server on his floor made in a month. He was, by every metric visible to the human eye, in charge. He had no idea who was standing in his doorway. To understand what happened inside that restaurant over the next 47 minutes, you need to understand 2 buildings. Not 2 people, 2 buildings, because the buildings tell you everything the people will not say out loud. The Meridian on Wentworth sat in a converted textile warehouse. The renovation had cost $3.2 million. The ceiling beams were original, reclaimed oak, sanded and sealed, lit from below with warm amber spots that made every surface look like it belonged in a magazine. The bar was Calicotta marble, $6,800 per slab, 4 slabs long. The wine list ran to 9 pages. The cheapest entree was $34, and it came with a garnish that took a prep cook 11 minutes to assemble. The chairs were Wagner reproductions. The napkins were Irish linen. The restroom smelled like bergamot and cedar, and there was a small sign on the mirror that said, "Please enjoy your experience," in a font that cost a design firm $14,000 to select. That was the first building. The second building sat 400 miles south on a dirt road outside of Bennettsville, South Carolina. It was not a restaurant. It was a kitchen, a residential kitchen with a screen door that did not close all the way, and a porch that leaned 2 degrees to the east because the foundation blocks had shifted in a storm in 1987, and no one had ever had the money to fix them. The counter was Formica. The stove was a 4-burner Kenmore that had been repaired so many times the left rear element only worked if you pressed down on it with a cast iron skillet while it heated. There was a window above the sink that looked out onto a yard where a fig tree grew, the kind of fig tree that produces small, ugly, impossibly sweet fruit that no grocery store would ever sell, because it did not look the way a fig was supposed to look. A woman named Alma Jeffers had cooked in that kitchen for 41 years. She fed her neighbors. She fed her church. She fed strangers who showed up on the porch because someone 3 towns over had told them that if they were ever hungry and had nowhere to go, there was a screen door on Route 38 that would open for them. Alma did not call what she did a restaurant. She called it supper. She never charged a cent. She worked as a housekeeper during the day, 3 houses, 6 days a week, and cooked at night because she believed that the table was the one place in the world where no one had the right to tell you that you did not belong. She had 1 grandson. His name was Marcus. Marcus Jeffers grew up in that kitchen. He did not grow up wealthy. He did not grow up connected. He grew up watching a woman who had been denied a seat at a restaurant in 1971, turned away at the door because the owner pointed at a sign that said, "We reserve the right," build a kitchen where the only sign that mattered was the one she spoke out loud every evening before she served. "Come in, sit down. There is enough." Marcus learned to cook before he learned to read. He could break down a chicken at 7. He could make a roux by feel at 9, the color of peanut butter, his grandmother said, and not a shade darker or lighter, because a roux is patience made visible, and patience does not guess. She gave him a single index card when he was 12 years old. On it, in her handwriting, tight, slanted, written with a ballpoint pen that was running out of ink, was her recipe for brown butter pecan pie. It was not a famous recipe. It was not a complicated recipe. It was the recipe she had made for every funeral, every birth, every night when someone showed up on the porch with nothing and left with something warm in their hands. She told him to keep it. She told him he would know when to use it. Marcus kept it. He kept it through a full-ride scholarship to Johnson in Wales, where he was one of 3 black students in his cohort and the only one who could not afford the knife kit the program required. He bought his knives second-hand from a retired butcher in Providence who sold them for $40 and told Marcus to keep them sharp because a dull knife was a dangerous knife, and a dangerous knife was a lazy man's excuse. He kept the card through his first job washing dishes at a hotel in Charleston, where the executive chef called him boy twice in the first week, and Marcus said nothing because he needed the paycheck, and because his grandmother had taught him the difference between a fight worth having and a fight worth preparing for. He washed dishes for 14 months. He was promoted to prep cook after the sous chef saw him break down a case of chickens in half the time it took anyone else on the line. He was promoted to line cook 3 months after that. He never told the executive chef about the boy comment. He did not need to. The executive chef was fired for inventory discrepancies the following spring, and Marcus stood at the pass the morning they walked him out and said nothing and felt nothing except a quiet confirmation of something his grandmother had told him once. Standing at the Kenmore stove with the cast iron skillet holding down the left rear element, people who build their kitchens on cruelty always run out of ingredients eventually. He kept the card through culinary school, through a sous chef position in Raleigh, where he learned front-of-house operations by watching the owner's seat guests every Friday night and memorizing which tables she gave to which customers and why. He kept it through the 18-hour days of his first restaurant, a 12-seat counter-service place in Durham that he opened with $38,000 in savings and a small business loan that 3 banks had denied before a 4th approved. The first 6 months nearly killed it. Revenue was $1,100 a week. Marcus slept on a cot in the storage room because he could not afford rent and a lease at the same time. He served braised short ribs and collard greens and brown butter pecan pie made from that index card, and the pie was what saved him. Not because it was extraordinary in a way that food critics recognize, but because it was extraordinary in a way that grandmothers recognize. And the women in the neighborhood who tasted it told other women, and those women told their churches, and the churches told their communities, and within 8 months there was a line outside the door every Saturday morning, and Marcus had to add a second seating. Alma died during those 8 months. A stroke at 79 in the kitchen where she had spent 41 years. Marcus drove 400 miles south for the funeral and 400 miles north the next morning because he had a restaurant to open and he could not afford to close for 2 days. He did not cry at the funeral. He did not cry in the car. He cried once, 3 weeks later, standing in his own kitchen at 2 in the morning, rolling out dough for the pecan pie, and he looked at the index card pinned to the shelf above his station, and the ink was starting to fade, and he realized that the handwriting was the last physical thing she had given him, and that the recipe was not a recipe at all. It was a theology. Come in. Sit down. There is enough. That was the night he decided what the restaurant would become. The 12-seat counter became a 30-seat dining room. The 30-seat dining room became a second location. The second became 4, and the 4 became the Meridian Group. 11 restaurants, 214 employees, and a reputation that had been written up in every food publication south of Washington and 3 north of it. Marcus Jeffers owned every table in the Meridian chain, every chair, every slab of Calicotta marble, every bergamot-scented restroom. He had built it with his grandmother's recipe card in his breast pocket, and he still carried it there, not as a memento but as a compass. Because Alma Jeffers had died 4 years before the first location opened, she never saw a Meridian. She never sat in one of those Wagner chairs. She never tasted the brown butter pecan pie served on a $40 plate with a quenelle of mascarpone and a drizzle of sorghum reduction. But she was in every room. Her principle, "Come in, sit down, there is enough," was printed on the back of every menu in every location. It was the company's founding statement. It was the reason Marcus had started doing what he was doing now. The visits had begun 8 months earlier. Reports had surfaced, not through formal channels, because formal channels in the Meridian group had been carefully blocked at certain locations, but through quieter ones. An anonymous letter from a server in Richmond who described being told to let a table of black guests wait 20 minutes for water, while a white table that arrived after them was served immediately. A Yelp review in Raleigh that described a hostess seating a black family next to the kitchen door despite an empty dining room. A former employee in Charlotte who told a friend who told a board member that the flagship location on Wentworth had a manager who treated the restaurant like his personal kingdom and treated anyone who did not look like they belonged, his words, not theirs, like a problem to be removed. Marcus had read every report. He had read them at his desk in the office above the Durham location, the original 12-seat counter, where his grandmother's index card was pinned to a corkboard beside a framed photograph of the Bennettsville kitchen and a handwritten note that said, "Build the room she deserved." He had not responded to any of the reports publicly. Instead, he had begun visiting his own restaurants unannounced, dressed in clothes that would not identify him as anyone of consequence. He visited Raleigh first. He was seated without incident. He visited Richmond. He was seated after a pause that could have been a coincidence or could have been a calculation. He noted it and moved on. Then he visited Charlotte, and a host told him they were fully booked while he could see 3 empty four-tops through the window. And that was when Marcus understood that the problem was not one employee or one location. It was a culture. It was his culture. It was growing in his buildings, under his name, behind the menu that carried his grandmother's words. He wanted to see what his buildings did when they did not know he was watching. He wanted to know if the principle on the back of the menu was a fact or a decoration. That is how he ended up standing in the doorway of the Meridian on Wentworth at 11:42 on a Tuesday morning, wearing a jacket that smelled like the bus he had ridden to get there, carrying a backpack with a change of clothes, a notebook, and a manila folder containing 6 months of financial discrepancies traced to this location. He was not homeless. He had never been homeless, but he understood, in a way that Greg Hollister would never be capable of understanding, that the distance between being seen and being invisible in America was exactly the width of a clean shirt. Greg saw the jacket. Greg saw the backpack. Greg saw the stubble and the worn boots and made every calculation his system had trained him to make in under 2 seconds. And Greg said what he said. "Sweep the floor, boy." Marcus looked at him. Then Marcus walked past him, pulled out a chair at table 14, a four-top near the window with a view of the street, and sat down. The hostess, a 23-year-old woman named Aisha Odom, was standing behind the reservation podium when it happened. She had been working at the Meridian for 9 months. She had watched Greg do this before, not with these exact words, but with the same energy, the same physics of authority deployed against anyone who triggered his sense of disorder. She had seen him redirect black diners to tables near the restrooms. She had heard him tell a server to let a customer wait because they looked like they were going to ask for the lunch special and not order wine. She had filed one complaint in writing to the HR representative who visited the location quarterly. She had never received a response. She needed this job. She was 23, she had a daughter in daycare that cost $1,100 a month, and the tips at the Meridian were better than anywhere else she had worked. So she had learned to look at her shoes when Greg performed. She had learned to keep her face neutral. She had learned the geometry of survival, how to be present enough to do her job and absent enough to avoid becoming a target. But when Marcus sat down, Aisha did something she had not done in 9 months. She picked up a menu, walked it to table 14, and set it down in front of him. She did not ask Greg's permission. She did not check the reservation system. She placed the menu, made eye contact, and said, "Good morning. Welcome to the Meridian. Can I start you with something to drink?" Greg saw it from across the room. He was standing near the bar, adjusting the angle of a wine glass that did not need adjusting, and his jaw tightened in a way that every employee in the building had learned to read as a signal. He crossed the floor in 4 strides. He reached table 14 before Aisha had finished pouring water. "You do not seat people without checking with me first," he said to Aisha, not quietly. Then he turned to Marcus. "Sir, I am going to have to ask you to leave. We have a dress code and we have standards, and I have a responsibility to my guests to maintain both." Marcus looked up from the menu. He had not opened it. His hands were folded on the table, his backpack on the seat beside him. He looked at Greg the way a man looks at a clock, noting the time, not reacting to it. "What is the dress code?" he asked. Greg hesitated. There was no dress code. There had never been a written dress code at any Meridian location, because Marcus had specifically prohibited one when the company was founded. The back of the menu said, "Come in. Sit down. There is enough." A dress code would have made that a lie. Greg had invented the policy himself, verbally, as a tool, a movable barrier he could raise or lower depending on who was standing in his doorway. "It is at my discretion," Greg said, "and I'm exercising it." Marcus nodded. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not say who he was. He said one sentence. "I would like to order the brown butter pecan pie." Greg stared at him. The brown butter pecan pie was not on the lunch menu. It was a dinner dessert, available after 5. Greg told him as much, and there was satisfaction in his voice when he said it, the satisfaction of a man who has found a procedural reason to enforce a personal one. "Then I will wait," Marcus said. Greg's face changed. The satisfaction dissolved into something harder. He leaned forward, both hands on the table, close enough that Aisha took a step backward. "I am not going to ask you again. You need to leave this restaurant right now." The dining room had 8 occupied tables, 41 people, including staff. Every one of them was watching. Some had stopped chewing. A woman near the bar had put her phone down mid-text. A server named David, carrying a tray of appetizers, had frozen between tables 6 and 7, with the tray balanced on his left hand, his right hand suspended in the air, reaching for nothing. A couple at table 9 leaned toward each other and whispered something, and the man shook his head slowly, and the woman reached for her bag as if considering whether to leave. No one intervened. No one said, "Excuse me." No one flagged a server or asked for a manager, because the manager was the problem, and the system that was supposed to stop this was the system that had created it. Marcus let the silence hold. He did not fill it with protest. He did not fill it with credentials. He sat with his hands folded and his back straight and his eyes on Greg's face, and the silence did what silence does when one person in the room is completely still and another is vibrating with authority that is beginning to leak. It made Greg louder. "I will call the police," Greg said. He said it the way a man says something when he knows the substance is gone and only the volume remains. "I will have you removed from this property." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. A very specific kind of long moment, the kind that makes the other person aware that their next sentence has already been heard and accounted for. Then Marcus reached into his backpack. Greg flinched, a small, involuntary movement that he would later deny, but that 3 security cameras and 11 witnesses would confirm. Marcus pulled out the manila folder. He set it on the table beside the menu. He did not open it. He looked at Greg and said, "Sit down." Greg did not sit down. Greg called for David to put down the tray and help escort this man out. David did not move. Aisha did not move. No one in the restaurant moved except Greg, who reached for Marcus's arm. Marcus pulled his arm away, not violently, not dramatically. The way you pull a door closed when the wind is pushing it open, with just enough force to make the physics clear. "My name is Marcus Jeffers," he said. "I own this restaurant. I own every restaurant in this chain. I own the chair you are leaning on. I own the marble you poured your drink on this morning. And I own the menu that says 'Come in, sit down, there is enough,' which you have turned into a lie every single day you have walked through that door." He said it at the same volume he had ordered the pie. He did not stand. He did not raise the folder. He did not gesture or point or perform. He delivered the information the way his grandmother would have delivered a plate, placed in front of you, steady-handed without commentary, because the thing itself was the message. Greg Hollister's face went through 4 distinct phases in under 3 seconds. Confusion, recognition, calculation, fear. The fear was the one that stayed. It was the fear of a man who has just understood that the structure he built his authority on was never his structure. It was rented, and the landlord had arrived. At 11:51, Marcus opened the manila folder. Inside were 6 months of financial records, vendor rebates totaling $92,000 that had been redirected to a personal account Greg held at a credit union in Matthews. 14 termination records, employees fired without documentation, without cause, without the exit interviews that company policy required. A pattern of table assignments that showed, across 4 months of reservation data pulled from the digital seating system, that black guests were seated in a specific zone, tables 19 through 24, the 6 tables closest to the kitchen, the restrooms, and the service corridor. White guests were distributed across the full floor. The pattern was not random. It was architectural. Greg had turned his dining room into a map of his convictions, and he had done it so consistently that the data made it undeniable. At 11:53, Marcus made a phone call. He did not call the police. He did not call a lawyer. He called Helen Park, the company's chief operating officer, who had been sitting in a rented car in the parking lot behind the restaurant for the past 40 minutes, waiting. She walked in through the back entrance at 11:55 with 2 members of the company's HR team and a forensic accountant who had been reviewing the Wentworth location's books for 3 weeks. Greg watched them enter. He was still standing beside table 14. He had not moved. His hands were at his sides, and his mouth was slightly open, and he had the specific posture of a man who has just stepped off a curb he thought was a curb and is falling in slow motion, aware that the ground is coming but unable to do anything about the speed. Helen did not greet Greg. She greeted Aisha. She said, "You must be the one who filed the complaint last March. I owe you an apology. It should not have taken us this long." Aisha looked at Marcus. Marcus nodded once. Aisha looked back at Helen and said, "There were more. I wrote 4. I stopped because nobody responded." Helen said, "I know. We found them. They were deleted from the regional HR portal. We know who deleted them." She did not look at Greg when she said it. She did not need to. What followed was not theatrical. It was procedural, and that made it worse for Greg, because procedure was the weapon he had used against others for 6 years, and now it was pointed at him with the safety off. His company laptop was collected. His access to the POS system was revoked at 12:02. His key card was deactivated at 12:04. The forensic accountant sat down at the bar with a laptop and began walking through the vendor rebate discrepancies line by line, asking Greg to confirm or deny each entry. And each time Greg opened his mouth to deny, the accountant placed a printed bank statement beside the entry showing the exact deposit, to the cent, in his credit union account. The staff watched. They had gathered, not all at once, not in a crowd, but in the way that people gather when the center of gravity in a room shifts and everyone can feel it. David stood near the service station with his arms crossed. 2 line cooks came out of the kitchen and stood in the pass window, visible from the shoulders up, watching through the rectangle of stainless steel. A dishwasher named Thomas, who had worked at the Wentworth location for 4 years, and who had once been written up by Greg for speaking Spanish to a colleague on the floor, written up for speaking his own language in a room Greg claimed belonged to him, stood by the back hallway and did not move and did not speak and did not need to, because his presence alone was testimony. The customers began to leave quietly, 1 table at a time, the way people exit a building when they sense that what is happening is both necessary and not for them. By 12:15, the dining room held only staff, the corporate team, Greg, and Marcus. The space felt different with the customers gone, smaller, more honest. The marble and the oak beams and the Wagner chairs looked the same, but the performance they had been designed to host, the performance of exclusivity, of curated belonging, had been interrupted, and in its place was something rawer. Accountability has no garnish. At 12:17, Greg was formally terminated. Not in a back office, not behind a closed door. At the bar, in the dining room, in view of the staff who had worked under him for 6 years. Marcus had not planned it that way. He had intended to conduct the termination privately. But when Helen asked Greg to step into the office, Greg refused. He said, "You cannot do this to me. I built this location. I am the reason this restaurant succeeds." And he said it loudly enough that Marcus made a decision. If Greg wanted an audience, Greg would have one. Helen read the termination letter. It was 2 pages. It cited the financial discrepancies, the undocumented firings, and the discriminatory seating practices, each with specific dates, specific numbers, specific names. Greg's name appeared 41 times. Each time Helen said it, Greg flinched, not visibly, not in a way that anyone across the room could see, but in a way that Aisha, standing 6 feet away, could feel. The flinch of a man hearing his own name used as evidence. The termination paperwork was signed at the bar at 12:21. Greg's hands were shaking when he signed it, not from fear anymore, from the specific kind of anger that arrives when a man realizes that his power was never power at all. It was permission, and the person who granted it has just revoked it. Marcus stayed at table 14. He ordered the brown butter pecan pie. The kitchen made it for him. It arrived at 12:38 on a $40 plate with a quenelle of mascarpone and a drizzle of sorghum reduction, and Marcus ate it alone at the table where he had been told to sweep the floor 47 minutes earlier. He did not eat it with satisfaction. He ate it the way his grandmother had taught him to eat, slowly, attentively, with respect for the hands that made it and the ingredient that grew it. He tasted the pecans and thought of the fig tree in the yard, and the cast iron skillet on the left rear element, and the screen door that did not close all the way. Aisha came by the table twice, the first time to refill his water. She did it without speaking, because she could see that he was somewhere else, not in the restaurant, not at table 14, but in a kitchen 400 miles south, where a woman who would never sit in this chair had taught him that every chair mattered. The second time, Aisha came to say thank you, and her voice broke on the second word, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling the way people do when they're trying to keep something inside that has been pushing to get out for 9 months. Marcus told her she did not owe him thanks. He told her she was the only person in the building who had done the right thing when it was the expensive thing to do, and that the company owed her, not the other way around. Then he asked her a question that surprised her. He said, "Why did you bring the menu?" Aisha thought about it. She thought about it longer than she expected to, because the answer was not simple, and she had not examined it until that moment. She said, "Because my daughter is 3. And one day she is going to walk into a room where someone looks at her the way he looked at you. And I need to be the kind of person who hands her the menu. I need to be that person now so I can teach her to be that person later." Marcus did not respond immediately. He reached into his breast pocket and touched the edge of the index card, not pulling it out, just touching it, the way you touch a photograph or a scar or anything that holds more weight than its size would suggest. He looked at Aisha and said, "You already are." He left a $100 tip on a $12 slice of pie. He did not leave it as charity. He left it as acknowledgement. The difference between the two is the same as the difference between pity and respect. One looks down and the other looks across. 4 months later, the Meridian on Wentworth reopened after a 2-week internal restructuring. The dining room looked the same, the oak beams, the marble bar, the Wegener chairs. But the seating chart was gone. Not revised. Gone. Tables were assigned on a first-come basis, no zones, no discretion, no movable barriers. The new general manager was a woman named Claudia Voss, who had spent 11 years running a community kitchen in East Baltimore, and who understood, without needing to be told, that a dining room is either for everyone or it is for no one. Aisha was promoted to front-of-house manager. She had not asked for it. Helen had recommended her. Marcus had approved it. On her first day in the new role, Aisha pinned a photograph to the bulletin board in the staff room, a photograph of her daughter, 3 years old, sitting in a high chair at a restaurant table, eating a piece of bread. Underneath it, Aisha wrote 3 words. She sits anywhere. Greg Hollister was not arrested. The $92,000 in redirected rebates was referred to the company's legal counsel, and a civil recovery process was initiated. Greg hired a lawyer. The lawyer reviewed the documentation and advised Greg to settle. Greg settled. The amount was not disclosed, but the forensic accountant later told Helen that the settlement covered the full $92,000 plus legal fees, plus a penalty clause that Greg's own employment contract, the one he had signed 6 years earlier without reading the arbitration section, had specified for financial misconduct. Greg's own paperwork destroyed him. The system he had used to protect himself had a clause he had never bothered to read, and that clause was the instrument of his undoing. Marcus returned to the Wentworth location once more, 5 months after the restructuring. He came in through the front door, wearing the same canvas jacket, carrying the same backpack. He did not come to inspect. He came to eat. He sat at table 14. He ordered the brown butter pecan pie. And when it arrived, he reached into his breast pocket and placed the index card, his grandmother's handwriting, tight and slanted, written with a pen running out of ink, on the table beside the plate. He did not read it. He did not need to. He had memorized every word decades ago. The card was not there for information. It was there for company. It was there because Alma Jeffers had told him he would know when to use it, and he had used it, not once, but every day, in every decision, in every restaurant that bore a principle she never got to see printed on the back of a menu, but that she had lived out loud in a kitchen with a screen door that did not close. The Meridian Group operates 11 locations today. The 12th opens next spring in Bennettsville, South Carolina, a 12-seat counter-service restaurant on Route 38, on the same lot where the house with the leaning porch once stood. The menu will feature braised short ribs and collard greens and brown butter pecan pie. The chairs will not be Wagner reproductions. They will be mismatched, sourced from estate sales and church closings, because Marcus wants them to look like the chairs his grandmother pulled up to the table when one more person showed up on the porch and she said what she always said. "Come in. Sit down. There is enough." Nobody in that restaurant had the right to tell a man to sweep the floor, but one person in that restaurant had the courage to hand him a menu, and the question was never whether Marcus Jeffers belonged at table 14. The question, the only question that has ever mattered in any room, in any building, in any city, is who gave Greg Hollister the authority to decide. Because power that is built on the exclusion of others is not power. It is a lease. And leases expire. If this story made you think about the rooms you have walked into and been made to feel small, or the rooms where you watched someone else be made to feel small and said nothing, then you understand why these stories matter. They are not about revenge. They are about correction, about the slow, patient, structural work of making the principle match the practice. If that resonates with you, then you are already part of this. Stay. There is enough room here for everyone.